The guests left smiling, yet one would never wake again. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ervela. I love seeing our mystery circle grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices bring life to every tale. Let's begin. It was one of those mild English evenings in early September when the air carries the faintest scent of ripening apples and lavender. The lawns of Dovecote Manor were still bright from the late sun, and the soft hum of conversation floated over the table set for Mrs. Banbury's annual charity supper, a much-anticipated event in the otherwise uneventful village of Little Brimley. Miss Marple, seated comfortably near the rose trellis, was knitting a pair of pale blue mittens for a neighbour's child. Her needles clicked with quiet efficiency, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the assembled guests with that mild, bird-like curiosity that most mistook for absent-mindedness. She was, in fact, noting everything. How Mr. Henshaw, the local solicitor, filled his glass too quickly whenever Mrs. Danforth, the vicar's wife, looked away. How young Clara Winton, the heiress of Dovecote Manor, seemed preoccupied and rather pale beneath her usual composure. Clara had returned from London only a week ago, her engagement to Mr. Geoffrey Linton freshly announced. Yet there was a tightness about her smile that evening, a weariness behind her laughter. When Miss Marple remarked upon it later to Colonel Faversham, the retired army officer who always took charge of the raffle tickets, he dismissed it with a wave of his cigar. "London nerves, my dear Miss Marple. All these modern girls have them. Too many parties, too little sleep. She'll be right as rain once she's wed." But Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She had observed, during many long years in St. Mary Mead, that London nerves were often caused by something far less trivial and far more dangerous. As twilight deepened, supper was served beneath strings of paper lanterns. The clinking of cutlery and the strains of a gramophone mingled with bursts of laughter. Clara, seated beside her fiancé, barely touched her food. Her aunt, Mrs. Agnes Whitby, scolded her gently for being as pale as the moon. Geoffrey Linton, suave and self-assured, poured her more wine and murmured something that made her eyes flicker with discomfort. By the time the clock struck 9, the first drops of autumn rain began to fall, and the party moved indoors. The guests gathered in the drawing-room for coffee and gossip. Outside, the gardens grew dark and silent, except for the rustle of a curtain in the open French window. At 9:30, a scream shattered the calm. It came from the terrace. Miss Marple rose at once, quietly, but with remarkable speed for a woman of her age. Guests rushed toward the sound, their chatter dissolving into gasps. On the flagstone path, near the fountain, lay Clara Winton, motionless, her pale evening gown gleaming faintly under the rain. The wine-glass she had been holding was shattered beside her hand. Someone whispered, "She's fainted!" But Miss Marple, bending slightly, saw the unnatural stillness of the girl's face. She touched her wrist gently. Then she looked up and said very softly, "She hasn't fainted. She's dead." The next moments were confusion, Mrs. Whitby sobbing uncontrollably, Mr. Linton shouting for the doctor, Colonel Faversham cursing the slippery stones. Miss Marple stood back, her eyes sweeping the scene. Rainwater trickled over the paving stones, mingling with a thin crimson thread near Clara's sleeve. "Poison," murmured Dr. Haycroft after a hurried examination, his face ashen. "Most likely ingested, and very quick." Miss Marple looked toward the drawing-room, where the supper guests still murmured in disbelief. Somewhere among them, she thought, someone had offered Clara Winton her last glass of wine, and had known exactly what they were doing. and in the silence that followed, the old clock in the hall struck 10, its chime echoing like a quiet accusation. End of Part 1. The Hook. The Murder at Dovecote Manor. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? The village reacts, where gossip spreads through Little Brimley, and the first suspicions begin to form. By morning, Little Brimley was humming with speculation. The rain had stopped in the small hours, leaving the village washed clean, as though nature itself had tried to erase the events of the night before. But gossip, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was not so easily washed away. It seeped under doors and drifted through open windows, whispered over fences and simmered in teapots. By breakfast, every household knew that young Miss Clara Winton, poor, lovely, newly engaged Clara, had been found dead on her own terrace. At the Blue Boar, the village's modest inn, the regulars discussed it with the grim relish that only tragedy can provoke. "Poisoned, they say," muttered Mr. Pierce the butcher, thumping his mug down upon the bar. "In her wine, right there at supper. Fancy that, an heiress rich as the Queen, done in by her own glass." His companion, Mrs. Danforth, adjusted her hat and gave him a scandalized look. "Really, Mr. Pierce? Must you sound so cheerful about it? Poor girl, and such a pretty thing. I always said that London fiancé of hers looked the sort who'd bring trouble." Miss Marple, who happened to be seated quietly in the corner with her morning tea and a scone, did not interrupt. Her gentle eyes drifted toward the window, where the mist was lifting from the churchyard. She had listened to 5 different versions of the same story that morning, each more elaborate than the last. One claimed that Clara had been engaged against her will, another that Mrs. Whitby had been furious about the match. A third insisted that the old housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, had seen a shadow moving across the terrace moments before the scream. Miss Marple merely sipped her tea. People, she thought, always embroidered the truth to suit their own patterns. Yet beneath every story there was often a single common thread, and it was that thread she meant to find. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Cray from the County Constabulary had arrived at Dovecote Manor. A solid man with a square jaw and the perpetual air of having been inconvenienced, he wasted little time establishing himself as the authority in charge. He questioned everyone at the supper, the guests, the servants, even the cook, who had been preparing pudding when the scream sounded. "A straightforward case, I'd say," he announced to Colonel Faversham after an hour. "The poison was in the wine. Whoever poured that glass must have meant to kill her." "Then it's Linton," the colonel declared stoutly, puffing out his chest. "He was sitting beside her, wasn't he? Poured half her drinks. Looks like one of those smooth city types. Never trusted him." Miss Marple, who had come to the manor at Mrs. Whitby's request. "You always know what to do, dear Jane," stood quietly near the drawing-room fireplace, hands folded neatly before her. She listened as the inspector made notes. Her eyes lingered not on the grieving aunt or the agitated fiancé, but on the half-eaten supper plates still set upon the sideboard. Clara's was easy to spot, barely touched, the wine-glass now sealed away as evidence. "Mr. Linton," the inspector said, turning briskly, "you claim Miss Winton wasn't feeling well before supper." "That's right," Geoffrey Linton replied, his voice controlled but strained. "She'd been nervous all evening, said she'd had a headache. She insisted she was fine to dine with everyone, but she looked pale." Mrs. Whitby dabbed her eyes. "My poor niece was delicate, Inspector. She'd been worried about the wedding plans. Society affairs tire her dreadfully." "Worried about the wedding?" Miss Marple's soft voice drifted into the silence, mild as a question over afternoon tea. Mrs. Whitby blinked. "Why, yes, my dear. You know how girls are. She fretted over everything, flowers, seating, gowns. Ah! Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied by the answer, though her eyes twinkled faintly. In her long experience, true worry rarely came from seating arrangements. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. "Mr. Linton, you poured the wine, yes?" "Part of it," the young man admitted. "Others helped themselves. We were all talking. It wasn't a formal service. Clara had half a glass when I offered to refill it. She refused, said it tasted odd. I remember that clearly. Odd?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes," said Linton, running a hand through his hair. "Bitter. I thought it was just the bottle, perhaps turned. I fetched another, and she wouldn't take it. She said she'd have coffee instead." "Yet the glass was found empty," murmured Miss Marple. "How curious," the inspector frowned. "You're saying she changed her mind later?" "I don't know," Linton muttered. "Someone might have topped it up. There were a dozen people there, for heaven's sake." Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, wrung her hands from the doorway. "I cleared the table after coffee, sir. Her glass was gone then. Miss Clara took it herself, I think. Said she wanted a moment of air before the rain began. I didn't see her after that." The inspector grunted. "Then whoever met her on the terrace afterwards, well, there's your murderer." Miss Marple glanced toward the French doors. The garden beyond shimmered with raindrops, deceptively peaceful. "I wonder," she said softly. "People rarely go out alone unless they're waiting for someone or something." The remark hung in the air, delicate but sharp. Geoffrey Linton stiffened. "Are you implying she had a secret rendezvous?" "Oh, not implying, dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice full of gentle reason. "Only observing that young ladies don't often leave a roomful of company in the middle of conversation, especially when their gowns are not suited for damp weather." Inspector Cray scribbled in his notebook. "You think she meant to meet someone?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she expected to see someone. Whether by arrangement or surprise, we shall see." Later that afternoon, she walked with Mrs. Whitby in the garden, the two women moving slowly along the gravel path. The older lady clutched her shawl, still trembling. "Oh, Jane, it's too dreadful. Poor Clara, she had everything to live for. What could possess anyone to do such a thing?" Miss Marple murmured comforting words, her eyes scanning the damp ground. Near the fountain, the stones still bore faint stains, where rain had not yet washed away the memory of the night before. A single crushed flower petal lay near the edge of the path, lilac-coloured, delicate. Miss Marple stooped and picked it up. "From her bouquet, I think," she said quietly. Mrs. Whitby nodded tearfully. "She carried it all evening. Geoffrey gave it to her. Said it matched her eyes." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, and turned the petal over between her fingers. "Lilac, not white. A most unusual choice for an engagement supper." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage on the edge of the village. She lit her lamp, settled in her armchair, and set her knitting aside. Rain tapped softly against the window, steady and persistent. On her writing desk lay a small notebook in which she jotted details. Habitually, almost unconsciously. "Wine tasted bitter, refused refill, glass later empty," she wrote. Beneath it, petal crushed near fountain. Lilac bouquet, gift from fiancé. Her pen paused. Then another note, expecting someone after coffee. She leaned back, thoughtful. So many things did not fit neatly. If Clara had feared her fiancé, she would hardly have accepted his invitation home. If she had trusted him, she would not have looked so uneasy at supper. The bitterness of the wine suggested deliberate intent. But whose? Anyone could have poured from that bottle. Miss Marple recalled, with her uncanny memory for trifles, how Mr. Henshaw had refilled his own glass from the same decanter moments before the scream, and had shown no ill effects. The poison, then, must have been in Clara's glass alone. That pointed not to accident, but precision. Precision required motive. She thought of Mrs. Whitby's anxious expression, of Linton's shifting eyes, of the nervous maid who claimed to have seen a figure in grey near the terrace after 9. She thought, too, of how often tragedy in quiet villages was born not from passion, but from pride or fear. As the clock chimed 9, she closed the notebook gently. Somewhere among the polite guests and the perfectly arranged supper, a single human weakness had flowered into murder. It was never as complicated as people liked to believe. Someone had wanted the heiress gone, and someone else had known too much. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes soft but alert. In Little Brimley, secrets had a way of ripening quietly, like apples left too long on the bough. Soon enough, she thought, one of them would fall, and make rather a telling sound when it did. That morning sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage the next day, spilling across her writing desk where the little notebook lay open. She had slept little. The night had been full of restless thoughts, threads twisting and tangling in her mind like her knitting yarn when the cat got at it. By dawn, however, one small detail had begun to tug more insistently than the rest. She sipped her tea and read her notes again. Wine tasted bitter, refused refill, glass later empty, expecting someone. The pattern was beginning to take form, faint but distinct. At 9:30, a knock sounded at her door. It was Constable Pritchard, a young man with a good heart and a habit of stating the obvious. He looked slightly flustered, hat in hand, boots muddy from the lane. "Inspector Cray sent me, Miss Marple," he said. "Wants you to know he's called everyone from the supper back to the manor for further questioning. Says it's best to keep the statement straight." Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. "A very sensible decision, my dear. It's in moments of repetition that truth and invention tend to part company." She reached for her coat and hat. We mustn't keep the inspector waiting. The drive to Dovecote Manor was peaceful, the hedgerows glistening after rain, the distant hum of bees beginning their morning's work. But as the manor came into view, peace fell away like mist before sunlight. The household was in visible disarray. The maid, Susan, was weeping in the hall. Mrs. Finch had gone quite pale, and Mrs. Whitby, the grieving aunt, had shut herself upstairs, refusing to see anyone. Miss Marple was shown into the drawing-room, where Inspector Cray was pacing before the hearth, his brow furrowed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone suggested mild irritation rather than relief. "Glad you're here. These people talk in circles. I've half a mind to lock them all up until one of them blurts something useful." "That might take rather a long time," Miss Marple replied sweetly, removing her gloves. "People rarely blurt the truth, Inspector. They reveal it, quite unintentionally, when they think they're saying something else entirely." He grunted, unconvinced. "If you can make sense of them, be my guest." One by one, the guests were called in again. First came Mr. Henshaw, the solicitor, nervous, perspiring slightly, his fingers fidgeting with his handkerchief. He swore he'd seen nothing unusual, though he admitted rather too hastily that he'd left the dining-room for a breath of air just before the rain began. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "You stepped outside, through the French windows?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, shifting on his feet. "Just for a minute or two. I smoked a cigarette by the terrace. I didn't see the young lady then. When I came back, people were already shouting." "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "The rain had only just begun when the scream was heard. You must have gone out moments before she died." The solicitor paled, his handkerchief twisting tighter. "Coincidence, that's all. Coincidence." After him came Mrs. Danforth, fluttering and self-important, insisting that the poor dear child was doomed from the start. Such frailty, One could see it. She declared with solemn satisfaction that she had always mistrusted London matches, and that young Geoffrey Linton had a look about him too handsome by half. Inspector Cray rolled his eyes and dismissed her, but Miss Marple merely noted the rhythm of her words. Gossip, when repeated enough, became a sort of chant. It might not hold facts, but it hinted at fears. When Geoffrey Linton entered, the room seemed to shrink. He looked immaculate in his dark suit, his face drawn, but there was an edge to his voice that had not been there the day before. "I understand this questioning is necessary," he said coldly, "but it's intolerable. Clara's gone, and you're treating me as though I'd—" He broke off, fists clenched. Inspector Cray leaned back in his chair. "You poured her wine. She died drinking it. I'd say we're well within reason." Linton's jaw tightened. "If you're so certain, then arrest me. But you'll be making a fool of yourself." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "I dare say no one truly intends to make a fool of themselves, Mr. Linton," she said softly. "But one mustn't overlook small mistakes. They have a way of undoing clever plans." His eyes flashed toward her. "You think I poisoned her?" "I think," she replied mildly, "that people are rarely as calm as they appear when someone they love dies so suddenly. You seem, how shall I say, more angry than grieved." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Perhaps I am. I gave up everything for Clara. London, my career, my reputation. And now everyone looks at me as if I'd murdered her. Wouldn't you be angry?" "Indeed I might," Miss Marple said, but her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than politeness required. After he had gone, the inspector muttered, "Temper! Guilt often shows itself that way." "Or innocence," Miss Marple said gently. "Grief takes many shapes. But anger, yes, it is interesting. It tends to arise from frustration. Perhaps he's angry because Clara's death spoiled something he wanted very much. Her inheritance, possibly, or perhaps something she knew." That afternoon Miss Marple asked leave to speak with the maid Susan, who had been unusually distraught. The girl trembled as she entered, clutching a handkerchief. "I don't know what to say, ma'am. I didn't see anything. Only? Miss Marple encouraged kindly. Susan hesitated. "Only that Miss Clara was crying before supper. I brought in the flowers for the table. White roses they were, and she asked if I could fetch her the lilac ones instead. Said she couldn't bear the sight of white that evening. I didn't understand, ma'am, but she seemed frightened." "Frightened?" "Yes, ma'am. Not of Mr. Linton. Oh, no, she didn't even look at him. More like someone else was watching. She kept glancing at the window." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her imagination. The pattern was widening. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "You've been very helpful. Sometimes the smallest details tell the largest tales." Later, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple walked once more along the terrace. The stone gleamed faintly in the fading light. Near the fountain something caught her eye. A tiny, glinting fragment wedged between the stones. She knelt, brushing it free with her gloved fingers. It was a sliver of glass, very fine, almost invisible. Not from a wine-glass. It was too thin for that. She examined it closely, then wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief. When she returned inside, Inspector Cray was still at his desk. "Find something?" he asked skeptically. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "A fragment from a perfume bottle, I think. There was a scent about Clara last night. A very distinctive one. Do you recall it?" The inspector frowned. "Couldn't say. I don't notice such things." "Ah," said Miss Marple with a little sigh. "A pity. It might have been important." She went home with the fragment tucked safely in her pocket. The evening deepened into quiet darkness. The kind of quiet that makes even the ticking of a clock sound intrusive. Miss Marple settled by her fire, her thoughts turning over what she knew, the bitter taste of the wine, the missing moment when the glass had vanished, the frightened glance at the window, and the lilac flowers. It was not yet enough to name a murderer, but the shape of the truth was beginning to show itself. Someone had approached Clara under the pretense of comfort or conversation. Someone she half trusted. That person had convinced her to drink again, perhaps to calm her nerves. It would not have been difficult. People rarely suspect malice in familiar faces. Her mind went back to Mr. Henshaw's nervous insistence that he had merely stepped outside. She had seen such nerves before, men who carried secrets too heavy to manage, and yet she sensed he was not the killer. There was fear in him, yes, but of exposure, not guilt. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. In Little Brimley, secrets were like embers, buried but glowing still. All it needed was a careful breath of inquiry to make them flare. She smiled faintly, her hands resting in her lap. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself in ordinary conversations. Tomorrow she would visit Mrs. Whitby again, and perhaps pay a call to the village chemist. After all, poisons had stories of their own. Outside, the wind rose softly through the trees, stirring the last of the lilac petals that had fallen on the path. Petals that, like every trace of deceit, refused to stay buried forever. Stay buried forever. The next morning broke dull and windless, with a faint mist clinging to the hedgerows, as if the village itself were reluctant to face the day. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts already turning to Dovecote Manor. The evening's reflections had not brought rest, but rather a quiet certainty that something vital lay just beyond the reach of understanding. She dressed in her usual practical tweeds, fastened her brooch, and stepped out into the cool air with a determined calm that few would have recognized as the harbinger of pursuit. Her first stop was the small chemist's shop at the corner of the High Street. Inside, the air smelled of camphor and lavender polish. Mr. Hollis, the chemist, was a thin, watchful man with spectacles that made his eyes appear owl-like behind the glass. He greeted her with a polite bow. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. What can I do for you today?" "Oh, just a little inquiry, Mr. Hollis," she said in her mild, fluttering way. "I was wondering purely out of curiosity about poisons. Horrid things, of course, but one hears such dreadful stories. You see, I've been reading a detective novel where the poor girl dies after drinking wine, and I wondered what sort of substance could act so swiftly without leaving much taste." The chemist's brows rose slightly. "A grim topic for a morning, ma'am. But since you ask, well, there are a few such agents. Cyanide, of course, though that has a bitter almond odour and is quite unmistakable. Then there's digitalis, extracted from foxglove, or even morphine in heavy doses. But if you mean something subtle, something almost tasteless—" He hesitated. "There are modern compounds, chloral hydrate perhaps, or veronal, though those would make one drowsy rather than dead." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And would one need to buy such things openly?" "Some, yes," said Mr. Hollis, "but others could be obtained through a prescription, or in certain household tonics. Arsenic, for instance, though regulations have tightened. A determined person could find a way." She smiled her vague grandmotherly smile. "Ah, human determination. It can be most ingenious, can't it? Thank you, Mr. Hollis. You've been wonderfully helpful." As she stepped out into the lane again, she noticed a figure across the street watching her. A tall man in a dark overcoat, unmistakably Geoffrey Linton. He approached with long strides, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he said tersely, "you were at the chemist's. Are you prying into my affairs?" "My dear Mr. Linton," she said gently, "I rarely pry. I merely observe. Observation is such an undervalued habit, don't you think?" He gave a humourless laugh. "You may observe all you like, but you won't find what you're looking for." "I didn't kill Clara." Miss Marple looked up at him with soft blue eyes that somehow saw everything. "Oh, I dare say you didn't mean her harm, Mr. Linton. But harm, you know, is rather like gossip. It tends to spread farther than intended." He frowned, searching her face for accusation, but found none, only that mild, almost wistful expression that gave nothing away. "You think I'm lying," he said finally. "I think," she said, "that you are very angry at life, at circumstance, perhaps even at yourself. Anger makes truth slippery, don't you find?" Before he could reply, Mrs. Danforth emerged from the grocer's across the street, calling his name in her shrill, eager voice. "Mr. Linton, such dreadful news! Inspector Cray's just said there'll be an inquest. Tomorrow morning at the parish hall." She looked at Miss Marple with relish. "Almost irregular, but I suppose it must be done. They say you'll be called to testify, dear." Linton's face drained of colour. "An inquest already?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Danforth continued, clearly delighted to be the bearer of scandal. "And they've found something in the garden, something quite mysterious. A piece of glass or a bottle, I think." Miss Marple's heart gave the smallest flutter, though her expression remained placid. "How interesting," she murmured. "One never knows what a garden will reveal after a storm." When she arrived at Dovecote Manor later that day, she found Inspector Cray in the drawing-room, holding a small evidence envelope. Inside lay the sliver of glass she had discovered near the fountain. "So you were right, Miss Marple," he said grudgingly. "It's from a perfume bottle, the chemist confirms. Imported, expensive. Found a few drops left inside, too." Miss Marple looked at it closely. "Ah, then you must have smelled it. Sweet, wasn't it? Rather heavy, with a faint bitter undertone." Cray frowned. "You know it? I noticed it on Clara the night she died," she said softly. "A fragrance she hadn't worn before. Lilac and something else. Something sharp beneath. Perfume can be such a convenient disguise for unpleasant odours." The inspector blinked. "You mean the poison was in the perfume?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, "but perhaps mixed with it, or used to conceal a trace of bitterness in her drink. You see, the sense of smell can deceive when emotion is strong, and I suspect poor Clara was frightened enough that evening not to question what she was given." Cray scratched his head. "You think she was tricked into drinking it again?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "by someone she trusted enough to believe that a sip might steady her nerves." She turned to the window, watching the clouds move low over the fields. In her mind, the pieces were aligning. The lilac perfume, the bitter wine, the missing moment after coffee, and Clara's fearful glances towards the terrace. Someone had arranged that final meeting. Someone who knew she would come. That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Whitby. The house was quieter now, draped in the heavy stillness of morning. Mrs. Whitby sat near the hearth, her face drawn. "Jane," she said wearily, "I can't bear it any longer. They'll ruin Geoffrey if this continues. He's been through enough." Miss Marple poured her a small cup of tea. "You believe him innocent, then?" "Of course I do. He adored her." "And yet," said Miss Marple gently, "Clara seemed afraid the night she died." Mrs. Whitby's eyes filled with tears. "Afraid of what?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what we must discover. Tell me, my dear, was there anyone, besides her fiancé, who might have wanted to stop the marriage?" Mrs. Whitby hesitated. "There was talk about her inheritance. If Clara married, most of her fortune would transfer to her husband's control. My late brother's will was old-fashioned. It upset her terribly when she learned it." "Indeed?" Miss Marple leaned forward. "And who manages the estate now?" "Mr. Henshaw, the solicitor. He's been with the family for years. A good man, though rather nervous of late." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts whirring. Nervous men are often the best observers. They see everything but say nothing until pressed. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps I shall have a little talk with him tomorrow." When she returned home, the first stars had appeared over the village, dim and uncertain. She set the kettle to boil and took out her notebook once more. The entries were beginning to form a chain, each linked delicately to the next. She wrote carefully. Perfume bottle, concealed scent of poison. Estate inheritance will transfers wealth upon marriage. Mr. Henshaw, nervous, evasive, outside during supper. Her pen paused. Clara frightened. Why lilac instead of white? It was then that she remembered something Susan the maid had said. She couldn't bear the sight of white that evening. Such a peculiar aversion. Miss Marple closed her eyes, recalling the garden that night, the shimmer of the fountain, and the faint glow of the lanterns through the mist. White roses on the table replaced at Clara's insistence by lilacs. White, the colour of innocence, of bridal purity, and, in certain traditions, of death. Perhaps Clara had known more than she dared admit. Miss Marple sat back, her mind quiet but keen. There was still a gap, a missing motive connecting fear to action. But she felt it close now, like a shadow she could almost touch. The clock struck 10. Outside a dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. She listened to the hush that followed, broken only by the soft tick of her mantel clock. The village slept, but somewhere in that stillness was a restless conscience. Tomorrow would bring the inquest, and with it, she suspected, the first crack in the murderer's carefully painted surface. Miss Marple blew out the lamp and whispered into the darkness. "Truth does so hate to be hidden. It always finds its way out, one little whisper at a time." The inquest was held the next morning in the parish hall, a plain, echoing room with wooden benches and a faint smell of polish. The villagers filled it quickly, their whispers swelling and ebbing like the tide as each new arrival took a seat. They had dressed soberly for the occasion, though there was an unmistakable gleam of excitement beneath their solemnity. Little Brimley had not seen a proper scandal in years, and the death of Clara Winton, beautiful, wealthy, and so suddenly gone, was the kind that stirred every appetite for speculation. Miss Marple arrived quietly and took a place near the back, her knitting bag beside her. She nodded politely to Mrs. Danforth, who was already leaning toward her neighbour with a murmur that began, "Of course I shouldn't say this, but—" The coroner, Mr. Albright, a lean man with a precise manner, called the room to order, and a hush fell that was only half respectful. The proceedings began with formalities. The cause of death confirmed as poisoning. The timing fixed at approximately 9:30. Dr. Haycroft, pale and meticulous, described the symptoms and the faint chemical traces found in the glass. It was, he said, a fast-acting compound derived from digitalis. Taken in sufficient quantity, it causes cardiac failure within minutes. The bitter taste could easily be masked by alcohol or perfume. At that, Miss Marple's eyes lifted briefly. The inspector's earlier guess had been correct then, though she doubted he yet understood the significance of the perfume. Next came the testimonies. Mr. Henshaw was called first. He looked nervous, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he spoke. "Yes, I poured myself a drink that evening. No, I didn't pour for Miss Winton. I stepped outside shortly before 9 to smoke a cigarette. When I came back, I heard the commotion. That's all I know." The coroner's voice was brisk. "You left the room when?" I should say about 5 minutes before the scream. "Was anyone with you?" No, sir. Inspector Cray stood up. Mr. Henshaw, you were Miss Winton's solicitor, correct? I was, am. And you handled her estate? Yes, but only routine matters. The inspector's tone hardened. You're aware that her marriage would have changed the terms of her inheritance? Henshaw hesitated. Yes. Would it have affected you personally? The man's Adam's apple bobbed. No, of course not. My fees were professional. There was a murmur in the hall, the sound of a collective intake of interest. Miss Marple watched the man's trembling hands. It wasn't guilt, she thought. Not quite. It was the fear of being misunderstood, of becoming entangled in something larger than one could manage. When Geoffrey Linton took the stand, the air shifted. The women leaned forward. He was pale but composed, his dark suit impeccable, his voice low and steady. I loved Clara, he said simply. We were to be married in 3 weeks. She'd been anxious lately, but I never imagined. His throat caught. I poured her first glass of wine, yes, but she said it tasted odd, so she didn't drink more. I opened another bottle. I don't know how she came to have the poisoned one again. The coroner studied him. You maintain you did not offer her any further drink? I did not. Miss Marple's gaze was steady on him, unblinking. He was telling the truth, or believed he was. That was important. People lied often enough, but self-deception required its own artistry. Then came the maid, Susan, trembling as she gave her account. Miss Clara went out to the terrace after coffee, sir. Said she needed air. I think she was waiting for someone. The coroner's eyebrows rose. Did she say who? No, sir. But she looked frightened. Frightened? Yes, sir. As if she'd seen someone through the window. A ripple moved through the room. Miss Marple sat motionless, though inside her mind the picture grew sharper. A meeting, then, expected or at least anticipated. Someone had known she would come out alone. When the questioning was finished, the coroner summarized the evidence. Death by poisoning. The precise source uncertain. The circumstances suspicious. The jury retired briefly and returned with the expected verdict. Death by misadventure, cause undetermined. The legal phrasing satisfied no one. People filed out, muttering. Mrs. Danforth was the first to speak the thought on everyone's mind. Well, if that's justice, heaven help us all. Death by misadventure indeed. Someone put it there, and that someone's still walking free. Miss Marple, leaving the hall, thought the same, though she phrased it rather differently in her mind. Someone had indeed walked free, but not for long. Outside, the autumn air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of turned earth. The inspector caught up to her near the gate. Unsatisfactory business, he said grimly. But unless something new turns up, that's the end of it. I shouldn't think so, Inspector. Miss Marple replied mildly. Truth, like cream, tends to rise if one leaves it undisturbed long enough. He frowned. You've something in mind? Only a few questions, she said. For instance, why poor Clara wore lilac instead of white, and who gave her the perfume she used that evening? Cray looked puzzled. Perfume? Yes, the bottle fragment you found, it wasn't hers. Clara never bought imported scents. She preferred English garden fragrances. Her maid told me so. The lilac scent was new. A gift, perhaps. He scratched his head. You mean the poison was hidden in the perfume? Oh, no, said Miss Marple gently. Nothing so crude. But perfume can carry meaning, Inspector. You see, scents are quite intimate things. One doesn't accept them from a stranger. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Danforth under the pretence of returning a borrowed recipe book. The woman was, as expected, brimming with news. My dear, have you heard? Mr. Henshaw's left the village for London this morning. Business, they say, but I think it's guilt. And that fiancé, he's gone to pieces. Drinking himself silly, I hear. A dreadful shame. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, letting the torrent flow. She asked small questions, listening for what was not said. And at last, amid the flurry of gossip, a phrase caught her attention. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Danforth prattled, "and such a strange thing. Clara received a parcel last week, all wrapped in tissue. I saw the postmistress handle it myself. From London it was, and marked fragile. She signed for it herself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A parcel, you say? That would have been the perfume, perhaps." "Perfume? Oh, I don't know. But I did hear she looked dreadfully upset after opening it. Threw the paper straight into the fire." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "How very like her. Tidy to the end." When she returned home, she sat at her writing desk and took out her notebook. The pattern had nearly revealed itself now, each line of inquiry converging toward the same quiet centre. She wrote slowly, as though the act of setting it down might summon the truth fully into view. Parcel from London. Gift perfume? Concealed message? Fear before supper. Meeting arranged on terrace. Poison disguised. Estate inheritance shifts after marriage. She paused. Who benefits by her death before marriage? The answer, when it came, was quiet and terrible in its simplicity. She did not gasp or startle. She merely folded her hands and stared out the window at the pale grey sky. The motive had been there all along, rooted not in passion, but in prudence. A solicitor who feared discovery could panic. A fiancé could rage. But only one person had both opportunity and quiet cunning. And yet proof was needed. A guess, no matter how shrewd, was not justice. Miss Marple rose and placed her shawl about her shoulders. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit the postmistress and ask to see the parcel log. People often believed the dead left no trail. But human intentions, she knew, always left something behind. A receipt, a trace, a whisper in the dust. As dusk deepened and the lamps were lit along the village lane, Miss Marple stood by her window, her expression serene. But behind her calm eyes the web was tightening. Somewhere out there the murderers slept soundly, believing themselves safe. They had forgotten the one truth Miss Marple understood better than anyone. No secret, however well buried, can survive the quiet persistence of a mind that listens. The next morning dawned bright but cold, the kind of deceptive English sunshine that makes the world seem gentler than it is. Miss Marple rose early and breakfasted on porridge and marmalade, her thoughts circling around the same small knot of questions. The parcel from London, why had it upset Clara so? A gift should please, not frighten. And who had sent it? The postmistress would know. Nothing passed through her hands unnoticed. Village post offices were, in their own way, as informative as confessionals. Miss Marple wrapped herself warmly and set off down the lane. The hedgerows were crisp with dew, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. When she entered the post office, Miss Greenway, the postmistress, was weighing letters behind the counter, her spectacles perched precariously on her nose. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Cold one today." "Yes, indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And busy, I see. I do hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, dear. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple leaned forward confidentially. "You know, Miss Greenway, such a dreadful business with poor Miss Winton. It occurred to me that she may have received a parcel the week before her death. Something from London. You wouldn't happen to recall such a thing, would you?" The postmistress's eyes lit with interest. "Oh, yes, I remember it quite well. Came in on Wednesday marked fragile. I made her sign for it. White paper, pink ribbon, very stylish. I even joked it looked like a wedding gift." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, her expression serene. "And who was the sender?" Miss Greenway pursed her lips. "Now, I shouldn't say, but as it's you, Miss Marple, The label said A. Whitby & Co., London. Funny thing that it caught my eye because of the name. I thought at first it was a relative sending it. Relatives. Miss Marple's knitting bag swayed slightly as her hand tightened on it. How curious, she said softly. Did you notice if Miss Winton said anything upon receiving it? She went rather pale now that you mention it, said Miss Greenway, lowering her voice. Stood there staring at the label a good 10 seconds before taking it. I remember asking if she was all right, and she just smiled, well, more of a grimace. Really? And said she hadn't expected a delivery. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and stepped out into the street, her thoughts moving swiftly now. A. Whitby & Co. A shop, or perhaps a firm, but carrying her aunt's name. Could Mrs. Whitby have sent the parcel? Unlikely, unless she wished to disguise the source. Yet the label's coincidence was too neat. When she arrived at Dovecote Manor that afternoon, the house seemed subdued, as though grief itself had drawn the curtains. Mrs. Whitby sat in the morning room, surrounded by sympathy letters she hadn't opened. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her face pale and pinched. "Jane, my dear, you're so good to come. I've scarcely the strength to face anyone." Miss Marple sat beside her, taking her hand gently. "You mustn't tire yourself, Agnes. But I've come upon something rather odd, and I thought perhaps you could help me make sense of it. Do you happen to know a business in London called A. Whitby & Co.?" Mrs. Whitby frowned. "No, I can't say I do. Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple softly, "it seems poor Clara received a parcel from that address only days before she died." The older woman's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm passing across her face. "From A. Whitby & Co.? That's very strange. I assure you I had nothing to do with it. Perhaps it was coincidence. The name, I mean." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice mild, "but the parcel seems to have distressed her. She burned the paper straight away, you know." Mrs. Whitby looked down, twisting her handkerchief. "I can't imagine what it could have been. She said nothing to me." Miss Marple watched her carefully. The denial was too smooth, too rehearsed. There was something deeper in the tremor of her hands, a memory pressing at the surface. But now was not the moment to press. "Of course," she said gently, "grief makes one see mysteries everywhere." After tea, Miss Marple asked if she might look once more at Clara's room, under the pretext of helping to sort her belongings. Mrs. Whitby, clearly relieved to busy herself with a tangible task, agreed. The room was neat, untouched since that final evening. On the dressing table stood a small silver-backed brush set, a jewellery case, and a powder tin. Miss Marple's eyes, however, lingered on the vanity mirror, where faint smudges of lilac powder still clung. She opened the top drawer, revealing neatly folded gloves and handkerchiefs. Beneath them, wrapped in tissue, was a small card, the edges slightly singed, as though rescued from a fire. Miss Marple held it up to the light. The words were faint but legible. "For your wedding day, may your future be as sweet as your past." No signature, but the handwriting, though elegant, carried a distinctive slant she had seen before. She slipped it back where it was, her pulse steady, but her thoughts racing. When she returned downstairs, Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was arranging flowers in the hall. "So sad, Miss Marple," she sighed. "She'd so much to live for, and all those fine things gone to waste now." "Yes," Miss Marple said absently. "Tell me, Mrs. Finch, who handled her correspondence after she passed? The letters, the parcels?" "Oh, I did, ma'am. I burned anything private as Mrs. Whitby wished. Didn't seem right to keep it." "I quite understand," said Miss Marple, "though I do wonder if there was anything with that same handwriting. Elegant, slanted, a touch theatrical." The woman looked thoughtful. "Now you mention it, there was a letter from London a few weeks back, written just so, came in a mauve envelope. Miss Clara went quite pale after reading it. "Do you remember the name?" "No, ma'am. I only saw the return mark, Eaton Square." Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave. Outside the wind had risen, scattering dry leaves across the gravel path. She stood for a moment gazing at the house, the grand facade hiding so much quiet deceit. Eaton Square, she thought, a London address, fashionable, discreet, and, in certain circles, convenient for maintaining appearances. That evening, she telephoned Inspector Cray. "I've been thinking," she said when he answered gruffly, "that it might be useful to learn whether Mrs. Whitby maintained any London accounts, business or personal." The inspector made a noise of mild exasperation. "You're suggesting the aunt had something to do with it now? Good heavens, Miss Marple, the woman's half dead with grief." "Grief," Miss Marple said mildly, "can be a complicated emotion, Inspector, particularly when intertwined with fear. I dare say it wouldn't hurt to check." He sighed but agreed to make inquiries. Miss Marple replaced the receiver with a faint smile. The pieces were aligning faster now, though she knew the danger of premature certainty. Every puzzle, she often said, had at least one false corner designed to mislead. Still, she felt the net tightening. The following afternoon, she took tea with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Danforth, who prided herself on knowing everyone's affairs. Between her sips of tea and sighs of moral disapproval, she mentioned something that made Miss Marple pause. "You know, I always wondered why Mrs. Whitby returned from London so suddenly last spring. She'd planned to stay a fortnight, but came back after only 3 days, looking dreadfully upset. Said she'd had a most unpleasant discovery and wanted no more of town life." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Did she indeed? How very human of her. People often flee from unpleasant discoveries, but they rarely escape them." That night Miss Marple sat by her hearth, with her knitting untouched. The fire crackled softly. She could almost see the scene unfold as if replayed before her eyes. Clara receiving the parcel, recognizing the sender, burning the paper in panic. A message disguised as a gift, sent not in affection but in warning, or perhaps threat. The poison, the perfume, the inheritance, all converged upon one simple truth. Someone had acted not out of greed, but out of desperation. She thought again of Mrs. Whitby, her trembling hands, her careful evasions. Love for her niece, yes, but also fear perhaps of ruin. If Clara married, control of the estate would pass entirely to her husband, and if certain irregularities in the accounts, irregularities managed by an over-trusting solicitor, came to light, scandal would follow. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Aunt Agnes," she murmured to the quiet room, "you've stitched quite a fine net about yourself, but one loose thread always betrays the pattern." She glanced toward the window where the moon hung low over the garden, casting pale light on the lane that led to Dovecote Manor. The time was near for confrontation, but first she needed one final confirmation. The handwriting, the truth of the parcel's sender. Tomorrow she would visit the vicar's archives, where parish ledgers sometimes revealed more about the living than the dead. And when she returned, she would know precisely how to pull that final thread and watch the whole tapestry unravel. The next day unfolded with an uncanny stillness, as if the entire village were holding its breath. A thin mist lingered in the lanes of Little Brimley, softening every edge, blurring every shape into something uncertain. Miss Marple, however, moved through the morning with quiet purpose. She had a list of errands that, to the casual observer, seemed harmlessly domestic. Visiting the vicarage, calling at the tailor's for a hem adjustment, perhaps stopping at the bakery for scones. But to those who knew her better, that serene manner and those small errands were the outward signs of something precise and deliberate. She was setting the final pieces of a puzzle into place. Her first stop was, indeed, the vicarage. Mrs. Danforth greeted her at the door, rosy-cheeked and bustling as ever, delighted to have company so early. "Miss Marple, you'll take tea, of course. Such dreadful weather. Fog's worse than London smog this morning." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, unbuttoning her coat. "If I might, I should like a quiet word with the vicar when he's free. Something of a parish matter, you see." Mrs. Danforth, always eager to be helpful, ushered her into the study, where the vicar, a mild man with thoughtful eyes, rose from his desk. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I hear you've been assisting Inspector Cray. Quite invaluable, I'm sure." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "I dare say I've only tidied a few loose ends, but I was wondering if you might do me a small kindness. You keep the parish ledgers, do you not?" "Indeed I do," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Baptisms, marriages, burials, records going back a century." "Splendid," she said softly. "I should like to see a few signatures, if I may. There's a particular hand I wish to compare. A lady's, quite elegant, somewhat slanted. I believe she may have signed the register in recent years." The vicar looked puzzled but obliging. "Of course, you may look through the visitor's book as well, if that helps. For the next half hour, Miss Marple sat by the tall window, flipping through the ledgers with patient fingers. Her eyes were sharp, taking in the loops and strokes of each name. It was near the back of the visitor's register, under a list from a charity bazaar 2 years past, that she found what she was searching for. Agnes Whitby. The handwriting matched perfectly. The same graceful slant, the same long tail to the Y. Miss Marple closed the book gently, her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. When she rose to leave, she thanked the vicar warmly. "You've been most helpful. It's remarkable how much one learns from handwriting. I always think character reveals itself in the smallest things. How one loops an L, how firmly one dots an I. Rather like truth, don't you agree? Hidden in plain sight." The vicar smiled, though he clearly didn't grasp her meaning. Miss Marple took her leave, stepping once more into the pale fog that blurred the path ahead. Her next stop was the chemist's. Mr. Hollis looked up from polishing a glass jar when she entered. "Miss Marple, back again? I hope you're not unwell." "Oh, not at all," she said lightly. "I only wondered, purely out of interest, if you recall who purchased Digitalis or any cardiac tonics recently. I know regulations are quite strict, but one does like to feel our village takes proper precautions." He hesitated. "Digitalis? That's not common, though there was a purchase last month, come to think of it. Mrs. Whitby requested some for her heart. Nothing unusual, a very mild preparation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, I see. Quite understandable at her age, though such substances can be most dangerous in less careful hands." When she left the shop, her suspicions had settled into conviction. It was all there, the parcel, the perfume, the poison. Yet what interested her most was not the act itself, but the curious psychology behind it. Clara's death had not been born of greed alone, but of fear. Fear of exposure, of disgrace, of the unravelling of a carefully maintained image. Miss Marple had seen it before, in quieter tragedies. Genteel desperation hidden beneath polished manners. That afternoon, she received a call from Inspector Cray. His voice, brisk as ever, carried a note of reluctant respect. "You were right, Miss Marple. We traced that London address. A. Whitby & Co. doesn't exist. It was a private postbox, paid for in cash by a Mrs. Agnes Whitby, about 6 months ago." "How very resourceful of her," Miss Marple murmured. "She must have sent that parcel herself. But why go to such trouble?" "Because," said Miss Marple, her tone mild but firm, "the appearance of innocence can be the most deceptive form of guilt. I imagine she wished to frighten the girl, perhaps warn her off the marriage without direct confrontation. Unfortunately, fear is a volatile emotion. Once awakened, it can lead to panic, and panic, as we've seen, to tragedy." Cray was silent for a moment. "You think she meant only to scare her?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "she meant to preserve her world as she understood it. But the line between preservation and destruction is very fine indeed." By late afternoon, the inspector had agreed to accompany Miss Marple back to Dovecote Manor. The fog had lifted, replaced by a sharp wind that rattled the windows and sent dry leaves tumbling along the drive. Mrs. Whitby received them in the drawing-room, her composure visibly strained. "Inspector," she said, her voice thin, "must we go through all this again? I've told you everything." "I'm afraid we must, madam," Cray replied. "We've reason to believe the parcel Miss Winton received was sent from a private box under your name." Her face drained of colour. "That's impossible," she whispered. Miss Marple, standing by the mantelpiece, spoke gently. "My dear Agnes, please don't distress yourself. I'm quite sure you never meant for harm to come. But you must see that truth will out, whether we welcome it or not." Mrs. Whitby sank into a chair, her hand trembling against her lace handkerchief. "It wasn't meant to kill her," she said at last, her voice breaking, "only to remind her, to make her think. I couldn't let her marry that man. He'd have ruined her. And when the accounts came to light, I should have been ruined too. I sent her the perfume because she loved the scent in her mother's garden. I added just a drop of tonic, enough to make her ill, not dead. I only wanted to frighten her into postponing the wedding." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "But fear can be unpredictable, my dear. When one tampers with trust, one cannot control its reaction. Poor Clara believed the wine tasted bitter. She thought she was being poisoned by someone else, perhaps her fiancé. And in that moment of confusion, she drank again, perhaps out of defiance or despair. The dosage you meant as warning became fatal." Mrs. Whitby's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant—" "I know," Miss Marple said gently. "You only meant to keep your world safe. But safety built upon deception always collapses." Inspector Cray, for all his bluster, looked momentarily uneasy. "We'll need a full statement, madam, and the chemist's record will support it." Mrs. Whitby nodded weakly, covering her face. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like an accusation. Miss Marple stood quietly, her expression calm but tinged with melancholy. She had seen this sort of tragedy too many times to feel triumph. Only the faint, inevitable sorrow that accompanied truth's arrival. As they left the house, the inspector turned to her. "You always seem to see straight through people, Miss Marple. How do you do it?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, I don't see through them, Inspector. I merely recognize them. You see, human nature is very much the same everywhere, whether in a grand manor or a modest cottage. Fear, pride, love, guilt, they all wear the same face if one looks closely enough." The wind had quieted by the time she reached her own gate. The lamps glowed softly in the mist, and the village seemed to breathe again after days of tension. In her sitting room, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the fire. Her knitting lay in her lap, though she did not yet take it up. Instead, she gazed into the flames, thinking of Clara's pale face, of Agnes Whitby's trembling confession, and of the fragile balance between love and control that had shattered so easily. The clock chimed 7. Outside, the fog began to thin, revealing the faint shimmer of stars above the dark hedgerows. Miss Marple smiled sadly to herself. "Ah, poor things," she murmured. "How little they understand that truth is never cruel. Only our attempts to hide it are." The following morning brought with it a curious quiet, the kind that settles over a village after the storm of revelation. Word of Mrs. Whitby's confession had not yet reached Little Brimley in its entirety, but enough whispers drifted through the lanes to give shape to the scandal. Doors closed more softly, conversations faltered when footsteps approached, and shopkeepers exchanged glances heavy with speculation. Yet for all the subdued gossip, there was something incomplete in the air, a sense that the tale was not quite finished. That truth, however much uncovered, still left a corner in shadow. Miss Marple felt it too, as she sat by her breakfast table that morning, spooning sugar into her tea. She turned the matter over in her mind. Mrs. Whitby's admission had been genuine. Of that she was certain. The woman's trembling remorse had been no act. Yet even as Agnes Whitby spoke, some instinct in Miss Marple had stirred. A faint unease, like the prick of a needle through cloth. The pieces fit but too neatly. Clara's death, tragic though it was, bore the fingerprints of calculation rather than accident. Mrs. Whitby had intended to frighten, yes, but not to kill. Someone else, Miss Marple suspected, had ensured that fear became fatal. The thought troubled her all through the morning. At 10:30, a knock sounded at her door. It was Inspector Cray, his coat damp from the mist and his manner brisk but subdued. "Came straight from headquarters," he said, setting his hat down. "Mrs. Whitby's been charged, but between ourselves, I'm not satisfied. Her story's too tidy, and the chemist confirms the bottle she bought couldn't have contained enough poison to kill outright. Even if she'd added a generous dose to the perfume, it wouldn't have worked that quickly. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though he were confirming her own thoughts aloud. "Quite so, Inspector. Digitalis is effective, but temperamental. A matter of timing and strength. If the fatal dose was not hers, then it must have been added later." He frowned. "You think someone tampered with it after she prepared it?" "Possibly. Or perhaps someone saw what she'd done and took advantage of it. A plan within a plan, as it were." She looked at him keenly. "Tell me, have you looked into Mr. Henshaw again?" "Henshaw?" Cray's eyebrows rose. "The solicitor? I thought we'd cleared him." "Perhaps too quickly," she said gently. "He had access to the house, to the wine, to the documents concerning the estate, and he was, if I recall, rather anxious during the inquest." The inspector gave a small grunt. "Anxious, yes, but he strikes me as weak, not wicked." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, you mustn't underestimate weakness. It can be quite as dangerous as malice, given the right provocation. Weak men, in my experience, often do desperate things when cornered. By afternoon, her suspicions had drawn her back to Dovecote Manor. The police had finished their examination, and the house stood quiet once more. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, answered the door, her face wan and drawn. "It's all so dreadful, Miss Marple," she whispered. "The mistress taken away, and the young one buried tomorrow. Feels as though the heart's gone out of the place." "I know, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I just wanted to tidy one or two small matters for Mrs. Whitby, things she'd left unsettled. I shan't disturb you long." The housekeeper, relieved to be given a purpose, led her to the study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lavender polish. On the desk lay several piles of correspondence, neatly arranged but not yet sealed. Miss Marple's eye caught on a drawer that stood slightly ajar. Inside were ledgers, estate accounts, tidy columns of figures, but one page bore an erasure so heavy the paper had thinned. She ran her fingertip lightly over the spot. "Mrs. Finch, she said softly. "Do you recall whether Mr. Henshaw visited this room often?" "Oh, yes, ma'am. Almost daily when Miss Clara was alive. He'd go through the papers with her, something about the accounts. They'd talk long after the mistress retired." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And on the night of the supper?" The woman hesitated. "Now that you mention it, I believe I saw him come in here after the commotion, when they found Miss Clara. I thought it odd, him going into the study at such a time. But I said nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. You've been most helpful." When she returned to the village, she went directly to the post office once more. Miss Greenway looked up with her usual curiosity. "Back again, Miss Marple? Another mystery, I suppose?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only a small one. I wonder, did any outgoing parcel leave Dovecote Manor the morning after poor Miss Winton's death?" The postmistress frowned, thinking. "Why, yes, Mr. Henshaw brought one down himself. Said it was legal papers, marked for London. Funny thing, though, it smelled strongly of wine. I remember because I thought it odd, papers being scented like that." "Wine," murmured Miss Marple, her eyes brightening. "Indeed, that evening she sat by her fire, her knitting untouched as she pieced together the sequence of events. Mrs. Whitby had added her mild dose to the perfume days earlier, intending only to sicken her niece slightly. But someone clever and watchful, had learned of her interference. When Clara hesitated to drink her wine that night, remarking on its bitterness, that person had recognized an opportunity. They had access to the cellar, perhaps even to the very bottle used at supper. A stronger dose, carefully administered, would seal the girl's fate. And with Mrs. Whitby's confession to conceal it, the deed would seem an accident born of misguided love. By 10 o'clock, she knew what she must do. She telephoned Inspector Cray once more. "If you're free in the morning," she said pleasantly, "I believe it might be wise to pay Mr. Henshaw another visit. Bring your warrant book, if you please. And do have a look in his outgoing post-bag. Something tells me you'll find a letter he very much hoped would never be read." The next morning, the inspector called for her in his motor car, a grim set to his mouth. "You'd best come along, Miss Marple. I have a feeling you're about to prove me a fool." "Not at all," she said cheerfully, as they drove toward Henshaw's modest house near the green. "You're merely cautious. It's an admirable quality in a man of the law." They found Henshaw at his desk, pale and twitching as ever. The inspector wasted no time. "We'll have a look through your correspondence, Mr. Henshaw," he said sharply. "Routine matter." The solicitor's protest died on his lips as the inspector opened a drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope. It bore the heading of a London bank. Inside were financial statements, altered entries, missing sums, and a draft letter to Mrs. Whitby herself, begging forgiveness for misappropriated funds. Miss Marple read the first few lines, then looked up. "So that's why you panicked," she said softly. "You feared discovery once Clara married. A new husband would examine the estate accounts and find your thefts." Henshaw's composure crumbled. "She was going to tell him," he whispered. "I begged her to wait, but she said she couldn't live with deceit. She threatened to expose me, to Agnes, to everyone, and then I saw her drop the perfume bottle that evening, saw Mrs. Whitby's guilt written all over her face, and I realized how simple it could be. One more dose in her glass, and everyone would believe the aunt had gone too far." Inspector Cray's pen scratched furiously across his notebook. "You slipped out to the terrace," he said, "claimed to smoke, and in that time you poured the poison." Henshaw's head sank into his hands. "It was only a moment. I didn't think she'd die so fast. I thought she'd—" "Be silenced," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Yes, Mr. Henshaw. That's often what people think before tragedy proves them wrong. When they left, the morning sun had broken through the mist at last, gilding the rooftops of Little Brimley. Miss Marple sat silently beside the inspector as the car wound back toward the village. Finally, he said, so the aunt's confession covered his crime. Quite unintentionally, Miss Marple said. Fear begets fear, Inspector. Mrs. Whitby's small deceit made the perfect shelter for his larger one. That's why human frailty fascinates me so. One never knows how far its shadow will reach. She smiled faintly as the car slowed before her gate. You see, Inspector, people think evil comes in grand gestures, but it rarely does. It's the quiet acts, the hurried lie, the momentary temptation that set everything in motion. He shook his head, still awed. You make it sound almost ordinary. Oh, it is, said Miss Marple, stepping out into the sunlight. That's precisely what makes it so dangerous. And with that, she walked up her garden path, the morning light glinting on her silver hair, while behind her the village of Little Brimley slowly returned to its tranquil, deceptive peace, its secrets once more tucked neatly beneath the surface, waiting for the next whisper of truth to disturb them. The following days brought a hush over Little Brimley, that peculiar self-conscious quiet that lingers after a scandal has broken, and before ordinary life dares to resume. The villagers spoke of the affair in careful tones, half respectful, half thrilled, while in the corners of shops and over cups of tea, the truth blurred and softened into rumour. It was said that Mr. Henshaw had broken down completely upon arrest, that he had confessed everything, even things no one had asked about. Some claimed he'd been driven by greed, others by love, and one imaginative soul suggested blackmail from London. Whatever the version, each retelling ended with the same refrain. And Miss Marple, of course, saw it all before anyone else. Miss Marple herself, however, seemed untroubled by fame. She went about her days quietly, tending her garden, writing letters, and attending the vicar's afternoon teas, as though nothing at all had happened. But those who knew her best, like the vicar's wife, or Dr. Haycroft, who often stopped by with prescriptions and village gossip, could sense a subtle restlessness beneath her calm. She had solved the case, yes, but something still nagged at her. It wasn't the crime itself. Its motives were as clear as daylight. Fear and greed, those old twin devils, had done their work as they always did. But there was another thread, faint and elusive, that tugged at her thoughts whenever she sat alone by her fire. Clara's final moments, the way she had gone out onto the terrace, the look in her eyes as the maid described it, expectant yet afraid. That did not fit entirely with the story of a young woman merely poisoned at supper. No, there had been something else at play that evening. Miss Marple considered it as she trimmed the lavender hedge outside her cottage. Clara had believed herself to be meeting someone. Susan, the maid, had said as much, and though Henshaw's confession confirmed that he slipped out after her, Miss Marple's intuition whispered that he hadn't been the one she expected to find waiting. Clara had gone out to meet someone she trusted, someone whose presence did not alarm her. She had stood there long enough, after all, for Henshaw to seize his opportunity. That evening, Miss Marple sat down with her knitting and her notebook, reviewing every detail she had written in the days since the murder. She had always found that written words had a way of revealing what memory alone could not. As she read through her notes, one entry caught her eye, one she had made early on, almost idly. Clara's fiancé poured the first glass, refused the second, but whose glass was moved before supper ended? She remembered now, the moment when Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, had said she cleared the table after coffee and found Clara's glass missing. At the time, She had assumed Clara herself had taken it, but had she? Or had someone else moved it subtly, during the confusion of conversation and rain and laughter? The idea would not leave her. The next morning she visited the manor again. It stood empty now, shuttered and silent, awaiting probate and new arrangements. Mrs. Finch was still in residence, keeping the place in order until the lawyers sorted things out. She looked surprised, though pleased, to see Miss Marple at the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch. I wonder if you'd indulge an old lady's curiosity," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "It's about the supper that evening, when the glass was moved." The housekeeper frowned, trying to remember. "Moved, ma'am? Yes, my dear. You mentioned once that when you cleared after coffee, Miss Clara's wineglass was gone. Do you recall who was still in the room?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Let me think. The Colonel was talking near the fireplace. Mrs. Danforth was gossiping as usual, and Mr. Linton was by the window, staring out at the rain. Poor man, he looked half beside himself. Was the inspector still there?" "Oh, no, ma'am. He hadn't arrived yet. It was just us, those who'd stayed for coffee." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did Mr. Linton speak to Miss Clara before she went out?" The woman's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, yes. He called her over quietly. I didn't hear what he said, but she looked troubled. Then she smiled, just a little, and went toward the terrace. He stayed where he was, smoking. Didn't follow her. Leastways, not that I saw." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind alight with quiet certainty. Geoffrey Linton, the fiancé who had lost everything, the heiress, the inheritance, the London fortune he had expected to marry into. He had been cleared too quickly, pitied for his grief. But grief, Miss Marple knew, was a peculiar thing. It could conceal as much as it revealed. She telephoned Inspector Cray as soon as she returned home. "I'm afraid, Inspector," she said, "that your case isn't quite finished after all." Cray, who by now had learned better than to argue, met her an hour later. Together they went to Linton's lodgings in the next village, a modest house belonging to an elderly couple who had rented him a room. He opened the door himself, looking worn and haggard, yet with a trace of the charm that had once turned heads at every fete. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, "to what do I owe this honour? Come to see how a broken man fares." "Something like that," she said, her voice mild. "We've been revisiting the details of that evening. There's a small inconsistency I can't quite reconcile." He shrugged. "What's left to reconcile? The guilty party's confessed, hasn't she?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, though her confession was, shall we say, incomplete. "Tell me, Mr. Linton, why did you ask Clara to meet you on the terrace?" He froze. The faint smile faltered. What are you talking about?" "You called her over after coffee," Miss Marple continued, her tone as gentle as ever. "You told her to come outside, didn't you? Perhaps you meant to speak privately. A quarrel, maybe, or an appeal. Love affairs so often end with words spoken in haste." His eyes darted toward the inspector. "That's nonsense. I never—" "Oh, but you did," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "She told the maid earlier that she meant to meet someone, and when she left the room, she went straight to the terrace door. You remained behind long enough perhaps to pour another glass. Her glass." There was silence. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to pause. Linton's hand trembled against the door-frame. "You can't prove that," he whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "No, you see, I thought so too." But Mrs. Finch remembered something else. "When she cleared the table, your glass and Clara's had been switched. The one she'd set down beside you was missing entirely. You poured the wine, Mr. Linton, not to share it, but to finish what Mrs. Whitby's foolishness had begun." He looked at her, colour draining from his face. "She ruined everything," he said hoarsely. "Do you understand? She was going to call off the wedding." Said she couldn't bear the lies, the debts, the talk in London. She said she pitied me." His voice cracked on the word. "Pity, Miss Marple, as though I was some charity case. I thought she'd only be ill for a time, that she'd need me, rely on me again. But she died before I could stop it." Inspector Cray stepped forward, his expression grim. "That's enough, Mr. Linton." But Miss Marple only sighed. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "love can be every bit as dangerous as fear. When wounded, it strikes blindly." Linton did not resist when Cray led him away. Outside, the wind had risen, scattering leaves along the road like whispered confessions. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, watching the empty lane. She felt no triumph, only that familiar, quiet melancholy that always followed the solving of a human tragedy. When she returned home, the fire had burned low. She sat in her chair, taking up her knitting once more. The needles clicked steadily, a soothing rhythm in the hush of the cottage. From outside came the faint toll of the church bell, marking the hour. Or perhaps, she thought, tolling for the lost souls of little Brimley. A foolish aunt, a desperate man, and a frightened girl whose only mistake had been trusting the wrong hearts. Miss Marple looked into the fire, her eyes thoughtful but serene. The world, she reflected, was a place of endless small cruelties disguised as affection, of selfishness dressed in the language of love. Yet amid it all truth remained, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to notice the detail others overlooked. With a faint smile, she murmured to herself, "Human nature, always the same, so terribly predictable and yet somehow endlessly surprising." And the clock ticked on, marking another peaceful evening in the village that never stayed peaceful for long. The morning after Geoffrey Linton's arrest dawned pale and sharp, a fine frost silvering the fields beyond Little Brimley. The village had scarcely recovered from the first scandal before this new revelation rippled through it. Though the police were discreet, news travelled on invisible threads. The grocer's boy who'd seen the inspector's car before dawn, the vicar who was summoned to offer counsel, and Mrs. Danforth, who claimed to have heard every sordid detail from a most reliable source. By midday, the entire village buzzed with the astonishing twist. The fiancé himself, once the picture of grief, had been the hand behind Clara Winton's death. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her parlour, heard it all through her open window as she wound her skein of yarn. She listened without comment, her expression mild but distant. Villagers would gossip, as they always did, and each would embroider the truth to their liking. Yet beneath their chatter lay something deeper, something she had seen before. The fragile comfort people take in believing evil is extraordinary, never ordinary, that it is found in strangers, not neighbours. She smiled faintly to herself. "Ah," she murmured, "how little we understand our own hearts." A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Inspector Cray, looking uncharacteristically subdued. He removed his hat as she invited him in. "I've come to thank you," he said awkwardly, "and to make sense of the mess that's left. Henshaw's signed his confession, and Linton, well, he'll hang, no doubt about that. But the papers, good Lord, they'll have a field day." Miss Marple poured him tea, the faint clink of china soothing in the silence. "People will talk, Inspector. They always do. But truth, once spoken, has a way of dulling even the sharpest tongues." He nodded, but his brow furrowed. "What puzzles me is how it all started. A simple deception, a frightened woman, and suddenly 3 lives ruined. I can't piece together how it all spiraled so quickly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It began long before the supper, I suspect. Such tragedies rarely start with a single act, but with small ones. overlooked, unremarked upon. Mrs. Whitby's pride, Henshaw's cowardice, Linton's vanity, all threads of the same tapestry. It only took one tear in the fabric for it to unravel entirely. He studied her for a moment, then said, "I wish I had your way of seeing things. You make murder sound like embroidery." "In a sense it is," she said softly. "Patterns repeating themselves, hidden stitches showing if one looks closely enough." Cray took a long sip of tea, then sighed. "We've arranged for Henshaw to give evidence. The poor fool's more broken than dangerous. As for Linton, he's calm now, almost eerily so. Says he's glad it's over." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Guilt can be curiously restful once accepted. He'll find peace of a sort. Too late, of course, but still peace." They spoke a while longer about the details, the charges, the estate, the burial. When the inspector finally left, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the street. Life, she noted, was already returning to its ordinary rhythms. Children chased a hoop down the lane. Mrs. Danforth hurried by with a basket of scones for gossiping purposes, and the church bell struck the hour. Yet, as always, there was that faint undercurrent, quiet sorrow beneath the hum of the village. It was this duality Miss Marple understood best. The coexistence of normalcy and tragedy, as inevitable as dawn following night. Later that afternoon, she walked to the churchyard. The air was crisp and still, the sky a washed-out blue streaked with the last of autumn's clouds. Clara Winton had been buried 2 days prior. The grave still raw and new beneath its simple white stone. A bouquet of lilacs lay atop it, their colour faintly faded by frost. Miss Marple knelt, brushing a petal with her gloved hand. "Poor child," she said softly. "So young, and yet she knew more fear in her last week than most feel in a lifetime." She remained there a while, her thoughts wandering not to the crime itself, but to Clara's expression that night. The look of quiet dread others had mistaken for illness. Fear, yes, but also pity. Clara had seen too much, perhaps, glimpsed the truth of those closest to her, and could not bear it. The rustle of leaves behind her broke her reverie. Mrs. Whitby approached slowly, her figure shrouded in a black cloak, her face drawn but calm. "I thought I'd find you here," she said quietly. Miss Marple rose and took her arm gently. "I wanted to pay my respects." Mrs. Whitby nodded. "I suppose it's foolish to come every day, but I can't seem to stay away. I talk to her, you know. Silly perhaps, but it helps." "Not silly at all," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief needs company, even if it's only the company of memory." They stood together in silence for a moment, the faint wind stirring the lilacs. Then Mrs. Whitby spoke again, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought if I could just guide her, keep her safe, she'd forgive me when she saw it was for her own good." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "You loved her, Agnes. But love is a curious thing. It blinds even the sharpest eyes. We try to protect those we love from the world, but too often we protect them from truths they have a right to face." Tears welled in the older woman's eyes. "I suppose I thought I knew best." "We all do," said Miss Marple gently. "And sometimes we do, until the world reminds us otherwise." Mrs. Whitby's shoulders sagged. "Will they show me mercy?" Miss Marple hesitated before answering. "The court may in time, but real mercy, my dear, must come from yourself." Mrs. Whitby nodded faintly, then turned away, walking slowly down the path toward the church gates. Miss Marple watched her go, the figure diminishing in the golden haze of afternoon. She thought how, in another time and another story, the woman might have been praised for her devotion. But life, she reflected, rarely drew its lines so neatly. As she walked back toward the village, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew long across the lane. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke. At her gate she paused, glancing once more toward Dovecote Manor, barely visible beyond the trees. Its windows caught the last glint of light before dusk, then faded into shadow. Inside her cottage, she lit her lamp and set water to boil. The small domestic act brought comfort, grounding her in the present after so much sorrow. When she sat down again by the fire, she took up her knitting where she had left off, the pattern half finished. A soft scarf for the vicar's niece. As her needles clicked rhythmically, her thoughts turned not to the murder, but to the people it had left behind. Mrs. Finch, loyal and kind, would find new employment soon enough. The maid Susan would marry her sweetheart from the post office. The inspector would rise in his post, perhaps more thoughtful for this experience. And the village would continue, as villages always do, pretending to forget what it had once whispered about. Yet beneath its calm, little Brimley would remember. The way people's eyes softened when they spoke of Miss Winton, the way doors closed a little earlier after sunset, and the way Miss Marple's light, steady presence reminded them that truth, however painful, was better than illusion. She looked down at her knitting, realizing she'd dropped a stitch, and smiled faintly. "So easy to lose the thread," she murmured. "But if one's patient, it can always be mended." The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. Outside an owl hooted, and the faint sound of church bells drifted over the fields. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folded her hands in her lap, and let the quiet settle around her. It was the kind of silence she loved, not empty, but full of meaning, like the pause after a story's final sentence when one is still caught between reflection and relief. She thought of Clara once more. Bright, gentle Clara, and of how fragile happiness can be when built on deceit. But then she thought, too, of the resilience of truth, of how even the smallest light finds its way through cracks. And as the fire burned lower and the night deepened outside, Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small private smile, wise and a little sad. "Yes," she whispered softly to the empty room. "Human nature never changes, and thank goodness it doesn't, or there'd be no puzzles left for the likes of me." The clock chimed 9. She rose, extinguished the lamp, and drew the curtains. Outside, the stars blinked faintly through the thin veil of frost, and the village of Little Brimley slept once more, safe, peaceful, and as ever, blissfully unaware of how close its quiet heart had come to breaking. The days that followed were slow and strangely quiet, the kind of stillness that always descends on Little Brimley after something terrible has happened, and the villagers are uncertain whether it's polite to move on. The newspapers had already lost interest. London papers called it the Dovecote tragedy, then moved on to a new scandal by week's end. But for those who lived among its ivy-clad cottages, the echoes lingered like smoke that would not clear. There were the usual murmurs of pity, of course. Poor Mrs. Whitby, now living in seclusion under her sister's care in Bath. Poor Mr. Henshaw, remanded but expected to face trial with leniency. And poor Miss Winton, whose grave had become a small pilgrimage for the curious. Yet beneath it all lay another feeling, one the villagers would never name aloud, a kind of wary relief that it had happened to others, not to them. Miss Marple, however, did not share that relief. She had seen too many such tragedies to believe they were rare exceptions. They were, to her mind, the natural consequence of ordinary lives meeting extraordinary folly. Evil, in her experience, was not monstrous but domestic. It wore the face of one's neighbour, or even of oneself, given the right temptation. And so, while others tried to forget, she found herself revisiting the case in quiet moments, as one might revisit a particularly intricate piece of lacework, marvelling at how fragile the pattern truly was. It was on one such morning, a week after Linton's confession, that a letter arrived for her. The envelope was cream-coloured, the handwriting neat and unfamiliar. She slit it open carefully and found a short note inside. "My dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I am Mrs. Clara Winton's solicitor in London. Her affairs are now being settled, and among her correspondence was a sealed envelope bearing your name. I thought it best to forward it directly, as it appears quite personal. Yours sincerely, Edward F. Merton, Esq. Merton, Esq. Merton." Inside the larger envelope lay a smaller one, the paper faintly scented with lilac. Miss Marple's hand paused before opening it. She knew, even before breaking the seal, what it must contain. The delicate stationery, the perfume. It was unmistakably Clara's. She unfolded the letter with care. "Dearest Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive this intrusion. We met only briefly at Mrs. Banbury's supper last spring, but I recall how kindly you spoke to me that evening, and how shrewdly, though I did not understand it then. I find myself in a position where I must trust someone outside my family, someone who understands people better than appearances. There are things I cannot explain to my aunt, or even to Geoffrey. Lately, I have begun to fear that what should make me happy has instead placed me in danger. Someone close to me has been untruthful, and I cannot tell if their deceit is to protect me or to harm me. I am not yet certain which. I write this in case something happens before I can act. If it does, please tell the truth, Miss Marple. I believe you will see it more clearly than anyone else could. Yours gratefully, Clara Winton. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment after reading. The letter trembled slightly in her hands, though her face remained calm. There was no bitterness in it, no hysteria, only a quiet, resigned foresight. Clara had sensed what was coming, as some sensitive souls often do, yet had been powerless to stop it. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Later that morning, she took it to the vicarage. Mrs. Danforth greeted her with exaggerated solemnity, as though expecting some new revelation. "Another twist, Miss Marple. Don't tell me there's more." "Only a letter," Miss Marple said mildly, "from Miss Winton herself. It confirms what we already knew, that she felt afraid, though she could not say why." Mrs. Danforth sighed dramatically. "Poor dear! Such intuition. Women always sense when something dreadful is coming, don't they?" "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, her tone gentle, "though sensing danger is not the same as escaping it. One must act, and that requires courage, and I'm afraid clear-sightedness. Miss Winton had the first, but not quite the second." The vicar joined them, looking grave. "A tragedy, through and through. And yet, Jane, it seems almost providential that you were here. Without you, the truth might never have come to light." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Truth always finds its way, Reverend. I merely helped open a few stubborn doors." But when she left the vicarage and stepped into the cool afternoon air, her thoughts lingered on that letter. It troubled her in a way she could not quite define. Clara's words had not only been a cry for help, they had been a bequest, a passing of responsibility. It was as if the girl had known that justice would fall to someone like Miss Marple, someone who could see what others preferred not to. That evening, as the sun set behind the church steeple, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. The air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and damp earth. She stopped at the post office to exchange pleasantries with Miss Greenway, who was sorting letters, and then at the baker's to buy a small currant loaf. At every stop she felt the same polite glances, the whispered gratitude. "Thank goodness for Miss Marple," they said behind her back. "Such a clever woman, and so kind." She smiled at the kindness but dismissed the flattery. Cleverness, in her experience, was not a virtue. It was merely the product of attention. People did not see because they did not wish to. They excused the flaws of those they liked and exaggerated those of people they disliked, and in doing so, they created their own blind spots. That was all human nature ever was, she thought. Selective blindness. When she returned home, twilight had deepened into a blue stillness. She placed the letter on her writing desk and lit the lamp. For a moment she gazed at the envelope, the faint scent of lilac rising again. It was such a delicate fragrance, too delicate for the bitterness it had once disguised. Miss Marple opened her drawer and drew out her notebook, where she kept a record of past inquiries. On the last blank page she wrote in her neat, steady hand, "The Dovecote affair. Concluded. Motives, fear, greed, and vanity. Lesson. One falsehood always breeds another, until truth itself must disguise as deceit to survive." She paused, tapping the pen against the page. Then she added, "Miss Winton foresaw her own fate, a tragedy of intuition unheeded." Satisfied, she closed the notebook and set it aside. The fire crackled softly. The clock ticked. Outside, an owl hooted across the fields. For a while, she allowed herself to sit quietly, her mind drifting. She thought of Clara, of Mrs. Whitby, of Henshaw and Linton, all of them ordinary people who had tried, each in their own way, to escape the consequences of their choices. They had been undone not by malice alone, but by the simple, desperate wish to preserve a version of the world that could not exist. A log shifted in the grate, scattering sparks. Miss Marple leaned forward, watching the glow fade into embers. It struck her then, as it always did after such cases, how much of life was shaped not by grand intentions, but by small, unguarded moments, by glances, by silences, by the fragile line between trust and suspicion. The knock at her door startled her. It was Dr. Haycroft, still in his overcoat, carrying a small parcel. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, smiling faintly. "I thought you might appreciate these. Lilacs from Clara's garden. Mrs. Finch sent them. Said you'd know what to do with them." Miss Marple took the parcel gently, the scent rising once more. "How thoughtful of her," she said softly. After he left, she unwrapped the flowers and placed them in a small glass vase on the mantel. Their pale blossoms caught the firelight, their fragrance filling the room. For a long moment she simply watched them. Then, with a faint, wistful smile, she murmured, "Lilacs again. Dear Clara, perhaps now they can mean peace instead of fear." She sat back in her chair, the warmth of the fire soft against her face, and resumed her knitting. Outside, the night deepened into silence, and in the quiet cottage the old woman's needles clicked gently on, steady, precise and patient, just like the rhythm of truth itself, weaving its pattern through the tangled threads of human life. The weeks passed quietly, and little Brimley, as villages always do, began to fold its tragedy into routine. The gossip grew gentler, the whispers fewer, until the Dovecote affair became just another story, one to be told at tea, half forgotten and embroidered with time. Yet for Miss Marple the matter never became mere gossip. It was another proof, as she would later reflect, of the endless small tragedies that occur wherever hearts deceive themselves. It was late November when she was invited to dine at the vicarage. The air outside was crisp and smelled faintly of rain on leaves, and the lamps along the lane glowed through a veil of mist. Miss Marple arrived in her usual fashion, punctual and smiling, her step light despite the chill. The vicar greeted her warmly, ushering her toward the hearth. Mrs. Danforth poured tea, unable to resist returning to the subject that still fascinated her most. "Do you know, Jane," she said, leaning forward eagerly, "I still don't quite understand how you managed it. How you knew. Poor Inspector Cray says you think in riddles." Miss Marple laughed softly. "Oh, not riddles, my dear, people. They are far simpler, though infinitely more deceitful." The vicar smiled. "Still, it was remarkable. You saw through all of them. The aunt, the solicitor, the fiancé. The rest of us only saw grief and confusion." "Grief and confusion," Miss Marple said gently, "are often the best disguises. One must look, as my nephew Raymond always says, for what doesn't fit." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. For instance, Clara's refusal to drink the wine that first evening. Everyone assumed she was nervous or ill, but in truth she recognized its taste. Digitalis has a very particular bitterness. It wasn't the first time she'd tasted it. Mrs. Whitby had given her the same mixture in her tonic days before. Clara knew her aunt meant to frighten her, not harm her, but that knowledge was itself a burden. It made her careful, perhaps too careful. Mrs. Danforth frowned. Then how did she come to drink it again? Miss Marple looked up, her eyes soft but steady. Because someone she trusted convinced her to. Linton's persuasion, you see, was his charm, his one real weapon. When she doubted him, when she thought to break the engagement, he was desperate. He played upon her pity, as weak men always do. He likely said he could not bear her coldness, that he would drink her wine to prove it safe. And she, poor girl, could not bear to humiliate him. So she drank. A moment's weakness, and it was done. And it was done. There was a silence. The fire crackled softly, the clock ticked. "Do you think he loved her?" the vicar asked at last. "In his way," said Miss Marple, "which is to say, not at all. He loved what she represented, comfort, admiration, an escape from his debts, love that demands nothing but devotion. In return is not love, Reverend. It is appetite." Mrs. Danforth gave a small sigh. "And Mrs. Whitby, what will become of her?" "Her health is failing," said Miss Marple quietly. "I dare say she will not live out the year, but perhaps that's merciful. She loved her niece, and yet her love was the first stone that set everything tumbling. We cannot always foresee the harm our goodness will cause." The vicar nodded gravely. Sin and folly so rarely come alone. They're like weeds, rooted in the same soil. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, and yet one mustn't despair. There is goodness still, though it seldom shouts its presence. I saw it in the maid Susan, who risked dismissal to tell the truth, in Mrs. Finch, who comforted her mistress when she least deserved it, even in Inspector Cray, who has learned, finally, I think, to listen before leaping." Mrs. Danforth chuckled. "He says you frighten him dreadfully." "My dear," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling, "that is because men dislike being reminded that observation is not a matter of strength, but of patience." They laughed softly together, and for a while the room was peaceful. The kind of domestic calm Miss Marple cherished most. After supper she thanked her hosts and walked home beneath a sky strewn with stars. The air was sharp, and her breath rose in white clouds as she passed the churchyard. She paused, as she always did, before Clara's grave. The lilacs there had withered now, their stems darkened by frost, but someone had placed a single white rose upon the stone. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She thought she knew who it was. As she stood there, she reflected that justice was never perfect, nor entirely comforting. It was a patchwork thing, like her own quilts, stitched together from scraps of truth and guesswork, pattern and accident. But it was enough. It had to be. When she reached her cottage, the fire had burned low. but the room felt warm with the familiar scent of lavender and smoke. She set the kettle on to boil and settled in her chair. On the mantel, the lilac blossoms she'd dried had faded to a pale grey, but they still held a faint sweetness. Beside them sat her notebook, closed now, its last entry written in her neat hand. Justice served, but not without sorrow. Evil seldom roars, it whispers, yet even whispers can be heard by those who care to listen. She added one more line before putting her pen away. Clara Winton, may her peace outlast her fear. Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze soft on the fire. It was nearly midnight, and the world outside was utterly still. She could hear the faint creak of the rafters, the settling sigh of old wood, a small sound and yet somehow reassuring. The sound of things enduring. Despite everything, her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to St. Mary Mead, and the garden she would tend come spring, to her friends, to her endless puzzles. She was an old woman, she thought, but not yet done. There would be other mysteries, other quiet crimes hidden behind polite curtains. There always were. Human nature, after all, never truly changed, and so, as the clock struck 12 and the last coal glowed in the grate, Miss Marple smiled to herself, a gentle, knowing smile, touched with both sadness and satisfaction. "Poor souls," she murmured, half to the fire, half to the night beyond her window. "They never mean to be wicked. They simply are." Then, with that final truth resting softly in her mind, she drew her shawl about her shoulders, blew out the lamp, and let the little cottage sink into peaceful darkness. One more night closing over the village, and over the quiet, indomitable heart of its most perceptive guardian.